Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about Stave III of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. So we'll start by summarising the plot, we'll then look at the key characters, themes, context and quotes for this stave, and last but not least I'll leave you with a couple of tasks you can complete at the end of the video to solidify your learning. So what happens in Stave III of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens? Well, our main character Scrooge wakes up and he waits for the second spirit that Jacob Marley promised would visit him. And Jacob Marley says it would arrive at 1 a.m. So Scrooge is awake and he's waiting, but the second of these spirits does not arrive. However, Scrooge does see a glow coming from one of the rooms in his house. So he gets up out of his bed and he follows the light into a room to see it's been completely transformed. So Scrooge's house is normally dark, damp, bare, grey, miserable. But this room was full of light, it was full of green, so full of plants and things that are alive, and it was full of food, full of meat and vegetables and fruit. And there, amongst all of that, Scrooge meets the ghost of Christmas Present. Now, the ghost of Christmas Present is described as a jolly giant, so he's quite large in size, and he wears a green robe. And he's supposed to represent a kind of St. Nicholas character, a Christmas character. So Scrooge gets introduced to the ghost and touches the ghost's robe and then is transported to a scene of London on Christmas Day. And Dickens in this chapter, or in this stave, depicts an idealised Christmas for his Victorian audience. And what we see here as they walk through London is we see shops full of meats and shops full of vegetables and fruits and shops full of decorations and people saying Merry Christmas to each other. Now, this is maybe a reality that the middle and upper classes can achieve, but Dickens also presents what Christmas would be like for the poorer Victorians. And to do so, the ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge to the home of his clerk, Bob Cratchit. So we go to the Cratchit's home. And once again, Dickens depicts an idealised Christmas Day. And some of these traditions still exist today, particularly in England. So the Cratchit family, even though they're very poor, they have a roast bird, a roast goose or chicken or turkey. They have potatoes as a carbohydrate and stuffing, and they have a variety of roast vegetables, and they finish the meal off with a Christmas pudding and an alcoholic drink. And to this day, most households in England would still celebrate Christmas with this sort of meal. When Dickens portrays the Cratchit family, it's very clear they're poor. The food maybe isn't enough to sustain such a large family, but none of them complain. And at the end, they only actually have a couple of cups for alcohol, and even one of them is broken, but they still share the alcohol out and no one complains and everyone's happy. So Dickens is presenting that even though you're poor, you're not necessarily bad people, you're still good people with love and family and all these good Christian values. You just haven't been given the money to enjoy it because of a power imbalance, a financial imbalance in the Victorian era. So Scrooge gets really invested in the Cratchit family, and in particular with Bob Cratchit's son, Tiny Tim. He's the youngest son and he is disabled. We know that because he's on a crutch. And the Scrooge actually asks the ghost of Christmas Present as they watch Christmas Day whether Tiny Tim will survive to see another Christmas. And the ghost replies, no, he won't. But actually, the ghost also throws Scrooge's words back at him. Back in Stave I, when the charity collectors came to collect money for the poor, Scrooge says, well, if they're poor, they might as well die and decrease the surplus population, linking back to Thomas Malthus's theory. So now Scrooge is invested in Tiny Tim. The ghost of Christmas Present throws the words back at Scrooge. Well, he might as well die. He's poor. Decrease the surplus population. And as a result, Scrooge is dismayed that he had this attitude. So leaving the Cratchit's home, leaving that happily poor Victorian family Christmas scene, the ghost takes Scrooge to 3 separate locations where we can see a really strong feeling of Christmas in quite a tricky environment. The first place is a miner's house. Now miners, they sort of live in the bowels of the earth. They go down, they dig up coal. A lot of miners fell ill. We would be able to identify it nowadays as like lung cancer or throat cancer from all the the air they were breathing underground. But even these people who worked hard, maybe had bad health, maybe weren't paid well, were quite poor, they were still singing Christmas songs. They had that happiness and sense of family that Scrooge doesn't have, despite having lots of money. The second place, the ghost takes Scrooge to a lighthouse. Now, with lighthouses, sort of two people work there, and they work sort of shifts, like 6-month-long stints. So they're away from their family, they're away from their loved ones, but they use Christmas as a way to come together. They wish each other Merry Christmas and they sing Christmas songs. And the final location the ghost takes Scrooge is a ship in the middle of a choppy sea. You know, you're definitely away from your family. You're not seeing your family this Christmas. There's a chance you may drown if there's some bad weather. But yet these tough, hardened sailors still sing and hum Christmas songs and treat each other extra nice and give each other Christmas greetings. So the message here the ghost is delivering to Scrooge is that the power of Christmas can overcome difficulties, whether you're a miner underground, a lonely lighthouse keeper, or a sailor stuck on a dangerous sea. Christmas can give you that love and strength and unity. And if you notice carefully, all of them sing Christmas songs, the miners, the lighthouse, and the ship. And remember, this book is called, or this novella is called, A Christmas Carol. So maybe in particular, it's this idea of a Christmas song that can be transformative for people. The Ghost of Christmas Present then takes Scrooge to a party at his nephew Fred's home. So remember, Scrooge had a sister called Fan, and Fan had a son called Fred. So Fred is Scrooge's nephew. And once again, Dickens portrays an idealised Christmas. Dickens basically wrote a guide to Christmas, which people still use nowadays. So Fred's family have had a big feast eating Christmas dinner. Most modern families will eat a Christmas dinner, a bit like the Cratchits one, with a bird, some potatoes, some vegetables, dessert, some alcohol. Fred and his friends sing Christmas carols. Again, most modern day Christmases, people will sing or play Christmas carols and brings joy to the household. And finally, Fred and his friends play Christmas games. And again, most modern families in Britain would probably play some kind of game and spend time together as a family on Christmas. So Dickens basically wrote a novella on how to do Christmas, and people still do it nowadays, which I find quite cool. Anyway, Scrooge is so absorbed in how Fred and his friends are enjoying their Christmas that he wishes to stay longer. He becomes like a young boy, and he says to the ghost, "Oh, half an hour more, please. I want to stay, I want to play, I'm enjoying myself." So Scrooge realizes that the key to enjoyment isn't loads and loads of money, it's people, it's food, it's songs, it's games. And this is the message Dickens is trying to get across. Scrooge then notices that the Ghost of Christmas Present is aging, and the Ghost of Christmas Present, at the very start of the stave, he said, "I've got 1,800 brothers." Now, this novella came out in the Victorian era, which was in the 1800s. So basically, the Ghost of Christmas Present only exists for one day, the day of Christmas. He's born on the stroke of midnight, and then he dies. He leaves this world on the stroke of midnight. Scrooge then notices there's some feet that don't belong to the ghost under his robe, his green robe. So the ghost lifts his green robe, and he reveals two horrible-looking children. One is a boy and one is a girl. And the Ghost of Christmas Present identifies them as Ignorance and Want. And the boy is Ignorance and has doom written on his forehead. Now, there's a few interpretations of what this could mean, but Ignorance, who is the boy, it could be the fact that the rich ignore the poor. That's one interpretation. They don't help the poor. The second interpretation, and the one I think is more powerful, is ignorance means a lack of education. And Dickens firmly believed that education was the solution to poverty. So his belief was if you could educate the poor, they could gain skills, they could gain jobs, they could lift themselves and their family out of poverty. The girl who's want, I think that's a bit more straightforward. She's in want of basic necessities. She's in want of food, drink, clothes, warmth, education. And the sort of prophecy Dickens has is that if we don't change this ignorance and want, if the rich don't help the poor, our society will be doomed. Now that doom could be like biblical. If you lead a bad life as a rich person and you don't help poor people, you're going to go to hell. Or the doom could be on a societal level. Maybe the poor people will have like an uprising, or there'll be a rebellion. So either way, if the rich don't help the poor, either in this life or the next, there'll be some element of doom. Scrooge then asks if anything can be done to help the poor children, and the ghost once again throws Scrooge's words back at him. Back in Stave I, when the portly gentleman came to collect money for charity, Scrooge says, "Oh, send the poor people to prison and the workhouses." And now the ghost says this back to Scrooge, "Well, just send them to prison or the workhouse." And Scrooge is mortified that he's had those thoughts in the past. And because of his mortification, we can see that he is changing as a character. Last but not least, Scrooge sees a phantom-like ghost of Christmas future, and on that sort of cliffhanger ending, Dickens closes off Stave III. So, who are the main characters in this stave? Well, there's the ghost of Christmas present. And what do we know about him? He's a jolly giant, so he's big in size. And I think this metaphorically represents Christmas being a big idea, having a big potential to change Victorian Britain. And this jolly giant has a glowing torch, and the glowing torch sort of sprinkles Christmas cheer on people. So as they were walking through London, the ghost of Christmas present was shaking his torch and sprinkling Christmas cheer on people, and people were saying Merry Christmas to each other, singing carols, doing all these positive Christmassy things. He wore a deep green robe and a holly wreath. So green is a colour associated with Christmas, and holly is a plant associated with Christmas. And the two main colours of Christmas tend to be green and red. So he wears a green robe. Holly is a plant with green leaves and red berries. And he's meant to represent a St. Nicholas sort of character, who was a Christian saint who sort of founded Christmas. So it's this idea of maybe bringing a thread of Christianity into Christmas. I mean, Jesus' name, Jesus Christ, it's in the name Christmas. And I think that sort of religious element was quite important to Dickens as well. And he saw that as a tool that he could use alongside this novella to help change Victorian Britain. The ghost only lives on Christmas Day, and his main goal is to spread Christmas cheer. So that's the second of the three ghosts, the ghost of Christmas present. Obviously, we have our main character, Ebenezer Scrooge, and we really see him change in this stave. So when he's at the Cratchits' house and he's watching this family who's poor, but they love each other and they get on well, he gets really invested in the welfare of Tiny Tim, and he asks the ghost, "Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." And then when the ghost says no and throws back his own words at him, well, he better die quickly and decrease the surplus population, Scrooge is overcome with penitence and grief. Penitence means you're sorry for what you've done and you've asked for forgiveness. Again, with the Christian Victorian society, this is very common in churches where you might go to the priest or the father of the church and you might ask for a penitence prayer. You might say sorry for your sins and that you want to change. So it's this idea of transformation, which I'll explore later in this video. Bob Cratchit's wife describes Scrooge as an odious, smelly, stingy, greedy, hard, unfeeling man. And she does this when when Bob Cratchit proposes a toast to Scrooge. And the omniscient narrator in the story describes Scrooge as the ogre of the Cratchit family. And this is a metaphor. This is saying Scrooge is an ogre. And an ogre is sort of like a mythical, fantastical, evil monster. And that's the sort of depiction of Scrooge to the Cratchits. He's a big, ugly, evil creature that takes loads of money and barely gives them enough to live on. However, Scrooge is softening more and more. So that means his heart is softening and he's open to change and he's starting to see the error in his ways. And there's indications that he might want to change as a character. Another key character is the Cratchit family as an entirety. So the Cratchit family is symbolic. They represent poor Victorians. Now, in the Victorian era, there were sort of two types of poor people. They were categorised as deserving poor and undeserving poor. Now, the undeserving poor were people who were poor because of their own mistakes, maybe alcohol, drugs, or gambling. And society had very little sympathy for them. It's their fault. Leave them alone. But the other type of poor people were the deserving poor. These are people who did the best they could, but they just happened to be born in poverty. And in the Victorian era, there was no social mobility. You couldn't go from working class to middle class. You were just stuck in poverty if that's where you were born. And these people deserve help. And the Cratchit family is a symbol for the deserving poor. They do everything right and they deserve people like Scrooge, their employer, to help them to a better quality of life. So we learn the women of the family have twice turned gowns. A gown is a sort of dress. Pardon me. And my understanding is when you twice turn it, is when you have a gown and the outside of it gets so dirty, you turn it inside out. And twice turned means, it's been turned inside out, it's been patched up, it's been stitched together, because this family can't afford new clothes. But the girls are brave in ribbons. So they've been to the shop, they've spent sixpence, which is probably a lot of money for them, probably all they could afford. And they've bought some ribbons to try and decorate their twice turned gowns. So even though they're poor, they do everything right. They try to dress in their Christmas best. They try to look happy and good for one another. And what they lack for in money, they make up for in love. When Martha Cratchit, the daughter, comes home late from work, her mother kisses her a dozen times. And the family plays a game where they actually hide Martha. And when Bob Cratchit comes home, they say that his daughter can't make it for Christmas. And he's so sad and crestfallen. And she loves her dad so much she can't bear it. She runs out and hugs him and says, "Oh, no, it's a joke." So what they lack in money, they make up in love. And you can see Scrooge as an opposite. Scrooge has no love but loads of money, whereas the Cratchits have no money but loads of love. And I think Scrooge is posing the question to his readers, what would you rather have, love or money? And if you're in a lucky position that you have both, could you use some of that money and with a heart full of love, help those who might not have money? The Cratchits are described by the narrator as not a handsome family. Again, poverty would leave some marks on you. You can't have maybe a full face or a full body full of colour and health because you're quite poor. You're not getting enough nutrition. They were not well dressed. We learn about that from the twice turned gown, brave in ribbons. Peter Cratchit, he's wearing clothes that are too big for him, which were Bob Cratchit's clothes. But what they lack for financially, in terms of food and clothes, they make up for in personality. They're happy, grateful, pleased, and contented. Another key character is Fred, Scrooge's nephew, and a lot of what Fred does in this stave is just laugh, ha ha, and ha ha ha. He's really, really happy. And when Fred talks about his Uncle Scrooge, he says his wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. Now, let me make it clear. I don't think Dickens is criticising rich people. He's not saying don't be rich. Being rich isn't a sin or a crime. Being rich and not using it to help people, that's what Dickens is considering a sin or a crime. So if you have wealth and you use it to help others, you're actually doing really good with it. Fred also wishes Scrooge a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, even though Scrooge keeps saying, humbug, go away, good afternoon. Fred has a very powerful Christmas spirit that even in the face of rejection, he still shows love and merriment. So, what themes are worth exploring in this stave? Well, transformation is big. Transformation means to change. Trans means to change. Transport means to change port, for example. Transformation means to change your form, to change your shape. The very start of this stave has a bit of foreshadow. Scrooge's house has undergone a surprising transformation. It's gone from grey and empty and bare and cold to green and full of food and life and laughter when the giant's there. And this foreshadows Scrooge's change as a character, from a grey, cold, lifeless man to a laughing, generous, full of life man by the end of the stave, by the end of the novella. In stave 1 of the novella, Scrooge is described as hard and sharp as flint, so he's physically and his personality is hard. But in this stave, he begins to soften more and more, and it's this idea that this flint, this stone, is softening up and its ideas are changing, and it's hinting at transformation. And this idea that he was overcome with penitence and grief, it's this acknowledgement that what he's done is wrong in the past by being selfish and greedy, and it's causing him physical and mental sorrow, and this is the catalyst for him to change and be generous with his money. Another key theme is redemption, and it's very closely linked with transformation. So, at the start of the novella, Scrooge was an evil man on the path to hell. He had the opportunity to help people, but he didn't. God would punish this, and when Scrooge dies, there's a very, very high chance he would be doomed to hell, or damned to hell. However, the four ghosts have come along. So the first ghost is the ghost of Jacob Marley, and then we've seen the ghost of Christmas past, and in this video, the ghost of Christmas present, and there's one more ghost, the ghost of Christmas future. And they all do a little bit of transformation on Scrooge, and as a result, by the end of the novella, spoilers, Scrooge is now on a path to heaven, as he's a good, generous man. So the ghosts have transformed Scrooge, have changed Scrooge. The ghosts have redeemed Scrooge. So redeemed means changed from a path that leads you to hell onto a path that leads you to heaven. That's your redemption. Now, we know that Victorian Britain was a largely Christian society, and in the Bible, Jesus Christ is mankind's redeemer. So the idea is that man sins after Adam and Eve, and then Christ comes along, and through the power of love, gives humans the chance to be good and go to heaven. So in this novella, the four ghosts are a little bit like Jesus Christ. Scrooge is committing sins, he's on his way to hell. The four ghosts / Jesus come into Scrooge's life and teach him love. And as a result, Scrooge has changed and is now on the path to heaven. It's this change, this transformation, this redemption is very biblical. And the Victorian readers at the time would fully understand that. Okay, what contextual historical knowledge would help you in this stave? Well, actually, as the ghost of Christmas present was taking Scrooge around London, the Sabbath bill came up. Now, the Sabbath bill, in Victorian Britain, many poor families did not own an oven. So instead, one day a week on a Sunday, they would go to the local baker to use their oven and cook their family meal, and then they'd all gather around and eat it. That's why in England it's quite traditional to have a roast dinner on Sunday, because that's when you get to use the baker's oven and you put all your meat and vegetables and potatoes and whatever you've saved up over the week, and you heat it up and you get to eat it together. However, there was a guy called Andrew Agnew, and he wanted to pass a bill, a law, the Sunday Observance Law, which was called the Sabbath Bill, as like slang. And the Sabbath in the Bible was the day of rest. Now, actually, in the Hebrew, in the Jewish week, the Sabbath is a Saturday. But for whatever reason in England, the Sabbath or the day of rest is a Sunday. That's why most churches open and most people go to church on a Sunday. So this guy, Andrew Agnew, wanted to pass this bill that would actually close all of the bakers on a Sunday, which means the poor of England would be unable to cook their one warm family meal of the week and gather together and make merry. And the reason he wanted to close it is because in the Bible it says the Sabbath should be a day of rest. People shouldn't do anything. But Dickens was like, this is ridiculous. Poor people need the chance to cook warm food and spend time as a family. So what he did is he wrote about this in his novella, and he wrote basically how stupid this idea was. And I believe the bill didn't get passed. So one genre that you could classify A Christmas Carol as is a social commentary. And this type of writing looks at society and comments on it and says, yes, I like these parts of society. No, I don't like these parts of society. And in A Christmas Carol, Dickens is definitely criticising Victorian England, but he's also changing Victorian England. He's stopped the Sabbath bill being passed. He's sort of brought Christmas as a festival back to the British people. So he's made a lot of change with his novella. And the proof of the Sabbath bill in this stave is when Scrooge says to the ghost of Christmas present, you would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day. And that's a reference to the Sabbath bill that Dickens' Victorian readers would have understood. The second historical bit of knowledge you need is education, and I mentioned it earlier. Dickens believed that education was the solution to poverty. And Dickens actually helped set up ragged schools, and these are schools for ragged children, children in rags, the poorest of the poor children in London. And Dickens and other people would help to teach these poor children how to read, how to count, in the hope that they can get useful skills to get a job and drag themselves and their family out of poverty. Now, at the end of the stave, we see this these two horrible children under the robe of the ghost of Christmas present called Ignorance and Want. And ignorance, in my opinion, really depicts a lack of education. If you're ignorant, you're stupid. So if you haven't been to school, if you haven't learnt the basics, you could argue that you're ignorant. And if you're ignorant, you can't get a job, you can't earn money, you don't have any useful skills, you can't get out of poverty. You'll be stuck in that cycle forever. So Dickens is really pushing education as the solution. And Dickens challenges his Victorian society, and he says, if we don't do something about this poverty, we are going to be doomed. And I think this has two meanings. You can be doomed in this world, where society is unsettled, and maybe there's uprisings and deaths. But I think you can also be doomed in the next life, remembering the Victorians were largely Christian, so probably believed in a heaven or hell. You could be doomed into hell if you had the ability to help people on earth, but you didn't. So what are the key quotes to memorise from this stave? Right at the start of the stave, it had undergone a surprising transformation. This is describing Scrooge's room in his house, but this foreshadows Scrooge's personality transformation. The ghost of Christmas present is described as a jolly giant with a glowing torch, deep green robe and a holly wreath, so he's sort of like a happy St. Nicholas character. If you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Scrooge says this to the ghost right at the start of the stave, so it shows that his heart has changed. He no longer fears these ghosts, he wants to learn from them and change. The Cratchit family, the girls wear a twice-turned gown and they're braving ribbons, so this sort of displays their poverty. They're a poor family. But what they lack in money, they make up for in love. Kissing her a dozen times, Mrs. Cratchit kisses Martha a dozen times, 12 times. As they eat the meal, Tiny Tim says a blessing, God bless us everyone. So it's this idea of bringing Christianity and this idea of God into Christmas. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. This is the ghost of Christmas present, and he's saying to Scrooge, if you don't do anything, Tiny Tim will die. But if is the key word here, because if Scrooge does do something, he can alter, he can change Tiny Tim's future. And that's a challenge to Dickens' Victorian readers. You have the power, if you're rich, if you're reading this novella, to change the future of someone poorer than you, so go and do it. If he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. So this is the ghost of Christmas present throwing Scrooge's words about decreasing the surplus population back at him. And this is a reference to Thomas Malthus's population theory. And if you can't remember what that is, go back to my first video of A Christmas Carol. Overcome with penitence and grief. So Scrooge is so upset about his previous attitude that he's grieving over it and he wants to change. Mrs. Cratchit calls Scrooge an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man. So this is the attitude people have to Scrooge. And metaphorically, Scrooge was the ogre of the Cratchit family. Dickens describes the Cratchits as not a handsome family, and they were not well dressed, but they were happy, grateful, and pleased with one another and contented. And this is a description of a deserving poor family. Fred comments that Scrooge's wealth is of no use to him because he don't do any good with it. So wealth is good, go and get wealth, but use the wealth to help others. That's what Dickens is saying. Scrooge softened more and more, so his personality changed from hard, like flint, to soft, so he's showing elements of love and change. Ignorance and want, they're two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. So those adjectives really describe them as horrible. One's a boy, one's a girl. They were yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish. Again, this list of adjectives describes poverty in horrible, animalistic ways, using colours and adjectives. And who is responsible for ignorance and want? Well, they're man's responsibility. Mankind made them by being greedy. This boy is ignorance and this girl is want. So ignorance meaning a lack of education or maybe being ignored by the upper classes. And want is the poor in need of basic necessities. They want the basics. On his brow I see that written which is doom. So if society doesn't change this and address the problem of poverty, we might be doomed in this life or in the next. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Again, this is the ghost of Christmas present throwing Scrooge's words back at him. And this is references to the laws, the prison laws and the workhouse laws at the time in Victorian England. If you can't remember what those are, see my video on Stave I. And finally, Dickens ends off with a little bit of foreshadow. We see this solemn phantom-like figure, this Grim Reaper figure, and that is going to be the ghost of Christmas Future. So please make some notes from this video on a physical copy of the novella, and please answer the question, what does Scrooge learn from the ghost of Christmas Present? So all the ghosts are there to teach him something. What is the ghost of Christmas Present teaching Scrooge? Make a point, use some quotes to back you up, zoom in on some keywords and techniques, explain what Scrooge is learning through these quotes and techniques. If you can, link it to some themes and link it to some context for extra marks. If you found this video useful, please like it, and please subscribe to my Mr. Hardy YouTube channel for the rest of my A Christmas Carol videos, and feel free to leave a comment if you think there's anything I've missed. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.